I'm not exactly sure when this story takes place, but I know that I was somewhere around or in between the first and third grade. Apologies, my memory isn't really the best, so just bear with me here. I never really speak about this with people, mainly because it feels more like a dream now, although I've clarified with my cousin that it was not. While I grew up, my mother and I lived in a flat for most of my childhood. It was a two-bedroom place, within what some may call a complex of flats and houses, located somewhere in El Dorado Park, South Africa, in which it was hard to find people who didn't know each other. Because it was just the two of us, my mother and I each had our own rooms, even though I'd always sleep in my mother's room, on a single bed she had kept there for me. Both before as well as after the encounter, I never liked being anywhere in the house at night without my mother or anyone else. It didn't matter to me whether the lights were on or not. Whenever the sun went down, it would always feel like I was being watched. Granted, both my mother and I always wrote it off as nothing more than an overactive imagination, due to the fact that we both always watched and loved horror movies. But even so, whenever I was alone at night, the fine hairs across my entire body would always stand strong, while the feeling of being watched would overpower any and everything I felt, matched only by anxiety and dread. Our story takes place in my old bedroom, the place that always freaked me out the most. I don't remember what or who it was for, but my mother was throwing a party. At that point, she had basically programmed me to steer clear of any sort of adult business or conversation, for better or worse, so myself and a couple other kids were sent into the very room I feared the most, although having other kids there with me helped ease most of my worries. We had already been in there for a couple hours, before I had a brilliant idea. I don't know why I did this, or why it even came to mind, seeing as I don't recall encountering anything of this sort before this point, although, as I said, my memory isn't the best. It was myself, my cousin, and a few friends of mine that lived at the flats as well. In total, there was around 5 or 6 of us present. After having our fair share of fun, I had the idea of showing them the so-called monster in my closet. Room layout. Apologies for all the context, but I feel that it may be needed at one point or another, or may help with overall clarity. Sorry if it's a bit confusing, but feel free to skip this section. If you stood at the door and looked into my room, you'd see that the room's door opened from left to right, with the light switch being on the left, in the corner, right next to the door. A queen-sized bed would be straight ahead, right underneath the window. If you stepped into the room and faced towards your right, the bed would now be on your left, and the door on your right-hand side. I never had any actual closets, but I had 2 antique cupboards, one for my clothes, and one for all my toys. The cupboard with all my clothes stood right behind the door, while the one with my toys stood way at the back, with only a rectangular table next to it, and a medium-sized carpet on the floor which I used to play on. I may not have had a closet, but the cupboard behind the door essentially worked as one, with the door on the left going from top to bottom, while the door on the right only went until halfway, with a few drawers underneath it. As I was saying, we had our fun, before I decided to show this to them. We all gathered by the door, closing it around halfway for us to get a view of the entire room, while I stood in the corner behind everyone else with my hand on the light switch. I then turned the light off, leaving us in the dark, with just a bit of moonlight shining in through the window, leaving us with just enough light to see what was going on inside. As we stood there, everything seemed normal at first, with my cousin and friends hammering me with questions as to what we were doing, with myself just telling them to watch as we stared into the darkened room. It didn't take too long before we watched as the door on the right side of the cupboard that was behind the door began to slowly creak open. Naturally, this freaked us all out, so I turned the lights back on and watched as the door shut, way faster than it opened, as we all ran out. Being kids, we stood at the entrance and laughed for a bit, making jokes while talking about it. We eventually went back inside and continued doing it around 2 to 3 more times, switching off the light and waiting for the door to open, before turning it back on and running out. It was fun for us, however, because I was a really curious child. On the 4th time we did it, I watched for a bit longer, in order to see if anything else would happen. After the door opened, I watched as everyone else ran out, making sure to keep my finger on the light switch. I watched as a single leg took a step out of the cupboard. Although the room was dark, I could clearly make out the leg and foot for the mere fact that the cow, it seemed to be absorbing all the light that it came in contact with, even though it wasn't much, making the room seem lighter than it actually was. To this day, I've never seen anything as dark as it was, or at the very least, as dark as it appeared to be. I immediately turned the light on and ran out, telling everyone what I had seen. They were skeptical at first, thinking I was joking, so after a little while, we went back and did it again for a fifth and final time. This time, because of the conversations we were having, my curiosity shot through the roof. I needed to see how that thing looked, so we did it all again. We watched the door open and the foot take a step out before they all ran out. Myself, on the other hand, stood and watched a little longer. This time, after watching the foot step out, I watched as its hand gripped the top of the door before using it as leverage to get out. As it stood in front of the door, its head and shoulders could be seen above the frame of the door and cupboard itself, meaning it stood between 8 and 9 feet tall. I was instantly frozen in place out of fear as my blood ran cold, and I had just realized the full scope of what I had gotten myself into. From where it stood, it slowly turned its head as it looked over at me. Its entire body was so dark that I couldn't see any facial features or anything. All I could make out was the shape of its body, what had looked like a pair of horns on its forehead, which seemed as if it sat right below the ceiling, as well as what appeared to be its eyes. Once it laid its eyes upon me, it felt as if it was looking into the furthest depths of my soul. Its eyes shined red within the darkness, as all surrounding sounds quickly faded away. It was just me, and it. Although it was most likely only a few short seconds, it felt like time itself stood dead still. I was still paralyzed with fear with my hand on the switch as it moved slightly around the door, leaning on it as it began to reach out for me. Although I knew I should have, I couldn't bring myself to move an inch. I watched as it got closer and closer, before my cousin claims she saw its hand through the moonlight of the window as it was reaching for me. She moved quickly, grabbing my arm and snapping me back to reality, which allowed me to flick the light on. As the light turned on, the creature vanished, and the cupboard door slammed shut as I ran out of the room, with my heart pounding as I breathed heavily. Tears began to run down my face as one of my friends went to call my mother, who sent everyone home shortly after. My cousin was the only one who slept over, even though no one had any intention of going home, other than my friends. To this day, we have no idea what that creature was. If anyone has any clues or idea, I'd love to hear them. Until then, the memory of the event will continue to live, rent-free in the minds of those who, where present,